Jesus in Mark chapter 7, now when the Pharisees gathered to him and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands according to the tradition of the elders, and when they come from the marketplace they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. Now, here we're dealing with legalism. We're dealing with something that has gone beyond the law of God and has been laid upon the people as the law of God. Okay, and the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" Guys, let me say this. If your hands are filthy, please wash them before you eat. It's a matter of hygiene. It's a matter of common sense. It's a matter of wisdom. It's a matter of looking after yourself. And particularly if you're handling food that other people have got to dish themselves up as well, and you've touched that food with your dirty hands, it's a matter of honor. It's a matter of good manners. It's a matter of these things. Go wash your hands. But they're not talking about that here. They're not talking about washing your hands on that basis. They're talking about washing your hands as a spiritual exercise, because the hands have been defiled by the world. These defiled hands now have to be washed so that the food doesn't get defiled, because if they eat defiled food, they will be defiled. It's interesting that Jesus at another place said to them, "Hey, you're not defiled by what goes into the stomach. It's the words that come out of your mouth that defile you." He's talking about when your words are in opposition to the word of God, those words defile you. It's not what you eat that defiles you. It's what's in your heart that defiles you. Now, they have diverted the truth from God is interested in the heart of man to God is interested in what goes into man's stomach. Now, of course, God has an interest in what goes into man's stomach, because God has made certain things to be eaten and he's made other things not to be eaten. And we read about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul said, now all things are lawful. Now, he sure as heck didn't mean that it's lawful for you to eat poison. He didn't mean everything's lawful, because everything isn't lawful. He meant all things that are lawful are lawful. If it's lawful, it's lawful. He meant that if God has made something to eat, it's lawful to eat it. If God has made it for food, it's lawful to eat it. But God hasn't made everything for food. There are even some animals that God tells us, listen, don't eat that because it's unclean. So, oh, that's Old Testament. What happened? Did the animal change? Did the animal suddenly become clean? God doesn't mean it's unclean because it's the Old Testament. He means the flesh is unclean. Why would an animal's flesh be unclean? Because it takes in all the toxic junk into its flesh. There are certain animals that God has created that will not toxify your system when you eat them. In other words, when you eat a pig, what does a pig do? A pig's flesh is made, a pig is made to survive with stuff in its flesh that if you had it in your flesh, you'd be in your grave. The pig is made by God to be like a vacuum cleaner. It can take in a bunch of junk into its flesh and run around as happily as you can get. And God's saying, look, if you want to kill that pig and eat it, you can eat it. But you know what? You're eating unclean flesh there, which means it's going to have an effect on you. It's not going to do you any good. You'll notice that when God says, I don't want you eating pork, for example, he's not saying, well, this is how I'm going to punish you if you do. He doesn't say that. There's nothing that says that. He just says, even Noah. So Noah, there's clean and unclean animals. Noah knew the difference. Well, how did Noah know the difference between clean and unclean animals? Well, some of them, their flesh is clean, and some of them, their flesh is unclean. Not that Noah was eating animal flesh. He wasn't until after the flood, when God gave him permission to eat animal flesh that was sufficiently full of protein from the vegetation that they would eat. And the flesh being clean in and of itself would be able to nourish man. And so man was given permission to do that, and that permission has never been withdrawn. It has never, ever been withdrawn. So we don't make special rules regards to eating and that. Paul just says, It's lawful. In other words, if God has made it for food, it's lawful. And so don't ban it if God has made it for food. And what he's basically saying is if some idolater actually has offered this food to an idol, what does that mean to you? It means nothing unless you're an idolater yourself. In other words, don't you get into that idolatry. But if you eat that food that has been offered to an idol, what does that mean? What's an idol mean? Nothing. The guy who offered it is the idolater. He gets the penalty. You don't get the penalty for eating that meat afterwards. You don't. You're not participating in his idolatry just because you eat the meat. Why? Because God made that meat for food. That's what Paul is saying there. And here you get the Pharisees. I mean, they're messing with all kinds of stuff now. You know, you can only eat the food if your hands have been washed this way, and food has been defiled, you can't eat it, and all of these extra rules. Dear God, where did that come from? Well, I tell you where it came from. It's much easier to make rules about food you put in your mouth than it is to obey God when it comes to your heart. It's a bunch easier to teach people rules about food that you put in your mouth and say the problem is defilement with your food than to teach the people defilement has to do with your heart. Than to teach the people your very thoughts will defile you when they're wicked. Your very thoughts will defile you when they're disobedient. Who wants to teach people about defiling thoughts when you can actually teach them about food, which if an unwashed hand touches the food, that's going to defile you? That's much easier. And so what these guys had done was the tradition of the elders was about changing the focus of God's jurisdiction, changing the focus of that jurisdiction from the heart of man. From God governs a man's heart. God governs a woman's heart. God governs the thoughts and intents of the very heart of man. The focus is shifted from that to God governs the food that you eat when it happens to have been touched by an unwashed hand. And now you're righteous if you wash your hands and thus don't defile the food, but they don't want to talk about the defiling of the mind. They don't want to talk about the defiling of the heart. They don't want to talk about what God's commandments have to say about the heart of man. They don't want to talk about the commandment, for example, thou shalt not kill, that governs a man's heart when it comes to hatred, that governs a man's heart when it comes to hateful anger, that governs a man's heart in so many ways. The law of God governs our heart, not just our actions. They didn't want to teach that. It's very unpopular to teach that. And so they taught an alternative understanding on all kinds of things, not just eating. Now, Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 deals with eating, and he's dealing with what the Pharisees had to say. And he's dealing with that continuation. Here, Jesus is dealing with what the Pharisees have to say. And watch what Jesus says here in verse 6. And he said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. And then he goes, this people honors me with their lips. And he tells them, you know who prophesied against you bunch? Isaiah did. Isaiah had it right when he prophesied against you. He's telling them, listen, you're not of the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You follow another faith here. You follow an alternative. You've changed the jurisdiction. You are in rebellion against my jurisdiction, claiming to be those that are actually establishing it. And they didn't even recognize Jesus as the Lord of that jurisdiction because they hated that jurisdiction. And they were establishing an alternative one.